crafty friends, today we're going to make a felt T-Rex. If you want this pattern, it is free and linked in the description below. You can get it and we're going to sew along together. For supplies, you're going to need a few different colors of felt, embroidery floss, which is just kind of thicker thread, an embroidery needle or one that can sew the thicker thread, some scissors, and the pattern again linked in the description below. Finally, this is a super beginner, kid-friendly level project, so sew along with me. Let's go. So step one, you're going to cut out your pattern and then we're going to trace it onto our felt. So you're going to want to do the body 2 times, the arms 2 times, the leg 2 times, the spine once, and each of the teeth sets 1 time. Then you're going to carefully cut them out and you want to cut off your tracing mark. So I like to trace mine with marker. I think it's easier to see, but then when you're cutting it out, you want to cut off all those black trace lines that you leave behind. Okay, once you have all of your pieces, it is time to start sewing some bits of our dinosaur. Before we piece together our dinosaur, we are going to sew on his eye and his arms and legs before we sew him all together. So I have some black embroidery floss, and you can see I've got this wide embroidery floss needle that just has a bigger tip right here. And I'm licking the end of my floss, I'm putting it through, and then I like to just pull it double. My string's a little too long for this, hold on. All right, I prefer just to pull it all the way through and then line up my 2 ends here, and we're going to turn this into a knot. So I'm going to do a loop, and then this top part I'm just going to tuck in to make a knot, and then I like to hold where it's crossed kind of close to the end and then just pull it tight to make a knot right here at the end. And then we're going to decide where we want our eyeball to be. So I'm going to say about here, and I'm going to poke it through. And I'm going to make him kind of an angled eye because he's a grumpy T-Rex. And I'm going to do a line across. I'm going to poke it back down. You can see my knot over here. And I like to just secure it extra by pulling it almost through and then putting it through those 2 strings and then tightening it. So now I have it knotted at the end and tightened. And then we're just going to sew kind of back by that first little bit. You're going to poke your needle through again, and we're just going to kind of make an eye shape. So you can pull it through a few times if you want. If you just want to do 1 and be good, that's fine. You're just going to have to do what works for you. So I'm just putting it through a few times, making the lines a little smaller each time I go. And I'm going to do that for our eye. And now I like to tie it again in the back. So to do that, I take my needle and I just poke it upwards through my threads. And then I'm going to take this loop right here, and I'm going to loop it over my needle as I'm pulling it through. And then I'm going to put my finger right here just to hold where that knot is and pull it tight. And now we have a knotted eyeball. I'm going to grab my scissors and I'm going to cut off the tail. And it's kind of messy back here, but it's working just fine up here. So again, I'm going to tie this into a loop knot. You do that wrapping it on the floor or just wrapping it around your finger. So we're going to curve it and tuck the tail under, so kind of pretzel shape. And then we're going to hold where the threads are crossing just lightly in your fingers and pull it tight. And that's going to put our knot in it. And I am going to make a second eyeball. I have kind of some extra loose thread over here, so I'm just going to trim that off as well. Okay. Now we're going to add his legs and his arms before we start sewing him together. Okay, so I'm going to do some floss this time that matches that green. And I like working with smaller amounts. So if you have a really long thread, I feel like it gets tangled more. So I would rather make new knots as I go than to have a super, super long one. Again, just going to thread my needle. Going to tie it again in that loop knot. Make sure my needle is at the end of the knot. I'm going to flip him over this way. So I've got my messy knot on this side, and I'm going to just poke this through here and through the leg. So I'm pulling through both sides. And then I'm going to poke it back through the felt, kind of similar to where it came through. And then I'm going to pull it through the 2 pieces over here and just pull it tight. And then I'm going to go through it 1 more time, because I just like a tight knot. So I'm poking it through and then I'm wrapping this around to knot it and pulling it all the way through. I'm going to do the same thing for his hand and for the other sides of him. Okay, So now we have two sides of our T-Rex with the legs attached, and we get to start sewing it together. So again, get a decent piece of this embroidery floss, one that matches. Mine's kind of tangled, so I'm going to just gently loosen some of it. Okay, and I don't like working with a super long piece, so I am going to have to knot mine as I go along. Okay, and then I do like my thread thicker as well. I'm going to thread my needle. And then I'm going to come over to my other end and I'm going to just tie that in a loop knot. So again, we're doing the pretzel, and you can hang on to where it's crossed and then slide it towards you. That gives me a nice little knot. And now we're going to put our two pieces of our T-Rex together. And I like to start behind this leg so it kind of hides where the knot stitch is. So I'm going to put my needle between both pieces of thread, or both pieces of felt, and I'm going to pull it all the way to the end, and then I'm going to pause, and I'm just going to separate out a few of these threads or kind of poke my needle through them and slide that down, and this is going to be my knot. If you want, you can trim off this at the back. You just want to be careful not to cut too close to your knot because you don't want it to slide out. These scissors are a little not sharp for that, but whatever. Okay, and now we're going to do something called a blanket stitch, which is the stitch that gives this kind of like line as you go along it. And we're going to do that around the end until we get to his tail. So the way that you do a blanket stitch is you take your needle and you poke it through both sides of your fabric, and then you take this tail where it's attached to the last place and you wrap it over and you pull it through. This is a simplified blanket stitch. We're going to poke it through both sides, wrap our thread over the top of it, and pull it through. We're just going to keep poking it through, wrap the thread over the top, and then pull it through. All right, so now we've got this blanket stitch started towards the end of the tail. Now we're going to grab our dino spikes and we are going to tuck that in. And once you have your spikes how you like it, we are going to do what's called a running stitch. And this one is even easier than the blanket stitch. You're going to go through one side of the fabric and then back through the other side. We're just going to move it along, going in and out. So out this side, making sure we're going through the spikes and both sides of the felt, and we're just going up and down through it. Up and down, up and down. And we're going to do this running stitch all the way up these spikes until we get to his head. All right, and I'm getting to the end here, and this is curving up a bit, so I'm just going to push it down with my finger, and even though it's kind of wrinkled inside, felt is very forgiving, and so it'll be just fine. It just means I have to hold it while I'm sewing until I get to the end. If you don't want to hold it, you can do a lot of this holding if you add some. So now we've got his spike sewn on, and we're going to go back to a blanket stitch around his face. So that means you're going to go through two pieces, you're going to wrap this around the front, and you're going to pull it through. Okay, so I had a weird stitch just there. I think that it curved around the back of my dinosaur, so I'm actually just going to take my needle off and I'm going to pull that stitch out. Now I'm going to rethread my needle and do it again. Okay, now I'm going to pause right here at the tip of his nose, and I've got two questions. So one is I've got a little bit of spacing right here. I'm just going to pull my needle through this and see if I can tighten that up a little bit. Whoop. There. Okay, now we're going to find his teeth. So the bigger teeth go on top. I'm going to set those in his mouth, and then again we're going to do that running stitch where we just go in and out, add the teeth into the mouth. Okay, so I've got his top teeth in. Now I'm going to add these bottom teeth. And I'm just gonna keep this running stitch going. Okay, and now when I've gotten to the end of the jaw, I'm gonna do a blanket stitch from the edge of the jaw all the way to the arm right here, and then I'm gonna stop for a minute. We're gonna start stuffing it. Okay, and right here, I'm gonna pause. So we have it pretty well stitched up, and we have a little space in the belly right here. Now we're gonna use that to stuff in whatever kind of filler you want. So I have all this scrap felt from where I trimmed out my dino, and I'm gonna stuff mine with this. I'm gonna cut some of the pieces up a little bit more so they're a little easier to manage. And you're gonna start by doing a small piece to stuff the further away things first. So his head is gonna be a little far in his tail. So I'm gonna take a small piece, so I'm just gonna wad it up, push it in the belly, and I'm just gonna push it with my finger. But if you're finding that you're having a hard time making your finger reach, you can also use the back of a pencil to push it in, or maybe even your scissors, depending on how wild you're feeling. I feel like it's not all the way in there. I'm gonna grab my scissors. I'm gonna just carefully push it up towards his nose. He's got some head fluff. Grab a little more, and I'm gonna stuff it into his tail. And I want it all the way to the back of his tail. Grab these others, put that in his belly. You can stuff it as much or as little as you want. Okay, and then when you feel like your T-Rex is stuffed pretty good, we're gonna keep going with this blanket stitch all the way back around to that back leg where we start. So I'm gonna pull it a little tight. Got a little loose while I was getting him filled. But I'm gonna continue with the blanket stitch. It's a little trickier now that it's full. Just go slow, go through both sides, pull your knot. Get it on this side and then on this side. I'm gonna loop it over, I'm moving his arm out of the way, pulling it through. Whoop. Okay, and then the last stitch takes me right back to the beginning. This one's a little special, so I'm gonna loop it over, and then this time I'm gonna do one more. I'm gonna put it through, and then I'm just gonna do that same blanket stitch, but this time instead of wrapping it once, I'm gonna wrap it twice. And I'm gonna use my finger to kind of, now that my needle's through it, I'm gonna hold that in place as I'm pulling this through. And then I'm gonna clip off the extra thread, or if you wanna be real sneaky, instead of clipping it off right there, you can poke your needle into your dinosaur and move it to the side, pulling that thread through, and then we can trim it off over here, and it'll pull the tail into the dinosaur so it kind of disappears. And there you have it. Here is our simple felt T-Rex friend. If you like this, be sure to like, subscribe, follow along, come back next week for another free tutorial, and drop me a comment of what pattern you would like to see next.